From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Trump promises 25% tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, but questions remain over possible exemptions and the potential for reciprocal tariffs from partners like the EU. We'll explore the possible impact with Erica York at the Tax Foundation.
And as Speaker Mike Johnson stands by his plan for a single reconciliation bill, we're joined by the man tasked with extending the Trump tax cuts. Congressman Jason Smith, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, joins on the path forward.
And a federal judge orders the Trump administration to unfreeze federal money for agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, as researchers warn of the impact on scientific innovation. We'll have the latest from Bloomberg News with analysis from our political panel. Thanks for joining us as we ring in a new week in Washington. We are waiting at this hour for President Trump to sign executive orders in the Oval Office and wondering if we're going to get further clarity on tariffs.
Yeah, that's right. It's another tariff day, it seems. And he was talking about this yesterday, of course, with the idea of targeting steel and aluminum. Specifically, Kaylee, we thought we'd be hearing from the president about 4 hours ago. They delayed this event, so you wonder who he might be on the phone with right now.
Yeah, but of course, he previewed what his intention was here. This is the president on Air Force One yesterday.
Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum, too.
10%?
10, no, 25%.
25 for aluminum as well?
25 for both.
That's how it went as the president flew over the Gulf of America. Joining us now is Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics. Jenny, it's great to have you back at the table and good to see you. You're waiting like we all are. To fill in some blanks here, what are the most important details that you're looking for, realizing we're talking about many trade partners, but specifically to steel and aluminum?
I think one of our key questions is going to be, what is the nature of these tariffs? Is this on top of the tariffs from his first administration? Is this targeted at countries that were exempted from those tariffs? The second thing is, he said there's no exemptions, but how long will that stay true? Are some of the conversations he's having today or in the next few days going to be kind of creating space for some countries to receive those exemptions? And I think the third question is going to be, when do these go into place? Is he going to do it immediately, or just like some of the other tariffs, is he going to build in some time for those negotiations?
Well, and when he says he'll be making announcements later this week as well on reciprocal tariffs, he's floated Tuesday or Wednesday. I guess we're going to have to wait and see. But what would that actually look like? Who is most likely to be affected by a reciprocal tariff from the U.S.?
So here there's a number of countries that could be at risk, and most of them are developing and emerging economies that have the greatest gap between the tariffs they impose on the United States and the tariffs that the United States imposes back on them. India is a key one, Argentina, Brazil, Southeast Asian nations. Certainly the EU, there is also a disparity there, and so Brussels is going to be watching both of these actions closely and sort of readying its ammo, I think, initially to make concessions and see if they can avoid it, but they're certainly prepared to come back and bite if they need to.
This is a double tariff on China, correct? The most recent 10% levy across the board went into effect today. And now Donald Trump is adding another tariff separate and beyond that when it comes to these materials.
Well, that'll be the key for reciprocal, because right now, depending on how you measure it, China might be able to escape the reciprocal tariffs. But yes, to your point, the 10% tariffs went into effect. China yesterday retaliated with its own set of actions. I think the key question will be, how does Trump read into those actions? Does that push him to retaliate against their retaliation, and that leads us into a trade war? Beijing's attempt was to go, we think, on the less escalatory side of the spectrum, avoid a trade war, but it all depends on how Trump reads this.
All right, well, we'll see what color we get from the president later on this hour. Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics, thank you. Now, a federal judge has ruled that the Trump administration must immediately unfreeze $3 trillion in federal funds. The decision was in response to a lawsuit filed by the attorneys general of 22 states who wanted to stop steep cuts facing the National Institutes of Health. It's the latest legal setback facing President Trump, who had this to say yesterday.
When a president can't look for fraud and waste and abuse, we don't have a country anymore. So we're very disappointed with the judges that would make such a ruling. But we have a long way to go. We have to find all of the fraud that's going on. We have tremendous fraud, tremendous waste, and tremendous abuse.
Now, we should note the Trump administration has already appealed the ruling from earlier today. So to get into this legal back and forth, joining us now is Bloomberg's Gregory Korte. So obviously, Gregory, it is the courts where we're seeing the greatest degree of pushback to the efforts of this administration, to the extent to which the vice president, J.D. Vance, over the weekend tweeted that judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate powers. Is this a suggestion that the administration doesn't actually care that much what the courts say?
Well, I think what happened here is that everything happened so fast and so furious right out of the gate of the Trump administration that nobody really even has a good handle on what's being frozen and what's not frozen. So you have a lot of social service providers, healthcare providers who are saying, look, we're worried about not getting reimbursed for services we've already provided. And the White House essentially denying that they were affected in the first place. So without the time to do extensive discovery on what exactly the state of play is, judges are coming in and just saying, let's just keep the status quo until we can sort all of this out to figure out whether the president does have the power to freeze a lot of these programs, some of which are discretionary, but some of which are mandated by Congress. Congress has formula grants that allocate certain amount to different states and says the president must allocate that money.
Congress has largely been watching all of this happen. There have been a lot of questions about what will be Democrats' posture, potentially pushing back on this beyond the courts. Over the weekend, we heard from the two senators from New Jersey. Both went on different shows on Sunday morning TV and threatened a shutdown if necessary. Is that how this finally spills over on Capitol Hill?
It's sort of a perverse response to say that if the president doesn't spend the money that we want him to spend, we're going to curtail his ability to spend any money by shutting down the federal government. But really, that just goes to show how few tools that Democrats have in their toolbox. If they're going to the shutdown, usually it's the Democrats who are opposed to the shutdown, the Republicans who are wanting to use it as a tool to impose some fiscal discipline.
Joe alludes to some interviews that took place on Sunday. Another one that aired yesterday was the president's sit down with Bret Baier on Fox before the Super Bowl. Apparently not all of it had aired, as we've gotten more this afternoon. He was asked directly if he sees J.D. Vance, the man he selected to serve as his vice president, as his successor. Gregory, his answer was no. Isn't he constitutionally, literally defined as in line to succession of the presidency?
Yeah, I absolutely. But the question is what happens in 2028 when Trump is presumably term limited. I don't think we'll change the Constitution in the next 4 years. And there is a question about his heir apparent. He started office this time as a lame duck, right, because he had already served one term. Vance is a full generation or two behind him in age. It was a little bit less than a complete vote of confidence, but also, to be fair, it's very early to be asking about a successor in 4 years. The normal political answer is for the president to stay neutral in his successor as he approaches the end of his term.
Or maybe say something nice about your vice president.
And maybe say something nice. And he said he was doing a good job, but to add insult to injury, he waited until Vance was overseas on his first foreign trip to make this pronouncement.
Man, it's a tough room sometimes. Bloomberg's Gregory Korte, we thank you so much, Gregory. As always, coming up, a look at the House Republicans' reconciliation battle we were just discussing with the man in the middle of it all. Republican Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri is chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. And he's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I appreciate the Senate's zeal. We have it in the House as well. But as I reminded my friend Lindsey, I have about 170 additional personalities to deal with, and he's only got 53 on the Republican side there. We have, a very diverse caucus with lots of interests, but we are going to get this job done. Remember that I have the smallest margin in history, about a 2-vote margin currently. So I've got to make sure everyone agrees before we bring the project forward, that final product. And we've got a few more boxes to check, but we're getting very, very close.
House Speaker Mike Johnson yesterday on the field, Super Bowl Sunday on Fox News, talking about the Senate putting together its own budget bill. Well, his chamber continues working on its plan. Joining us now is Speaker Johnson's colleague, the man who runs the Tax Writing Committee, Republican Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. I'm not going to ask you about your Chiefs, but I will ask you about the battle that is apparently about to get underway here on Capitol Hill. The Senate Budget Committee is set to mark up its own budget resolution starting Wednesday morning at 10. Is the Senate about to derail this whole process?
The Senate can do what the Senate does, and the House will definitely do our own thing. We said it crystal clear from the beginning. The Speaker's been very, very clear, is that there's going to be one bill. They can pop over a budget resolution. We can also drastically amend it and send it back. The best and quickest approach to deliver on all of the president's priorities that he campaigned on and 77 million people voted for is to be done in one big, beautiful bill.
Well, and as you say, Mr. Chairman, the Speaker has been clear about wanting one bill. He's been less clear on the timeline for this plan coming out. We've seen it punted a few times. Can you give us an idea as to what exactly the holdup is to seeing the details?
You know, it's a lengthy process. In order for the Ways and Means Committee to even just start writing tax policy, we have to have the instructions from the House Budget Committee. They have to have that budget resolution that instructs us what are parameters that we have to operate on. And that has a big impact. That determines whether the president's successful 2017 tax cuts are made permanent. It also depends on, like, how many other items can you look at, whether it's no tax on tips, no tax on senior benefits, no tax on overtime. These are all things that will be decided virtually by the reconciliation instructions, what kind of level of a level that they give us within the instructions.
We spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power today, Mr. Chairman, with Mick Mulvaney, of course, the former acting White House chief of staff, first Trump administration. He knows what it's like to work at OMB, and he was a co-founder of the Freedom Caucus. Here's what he said about how this reconciliation bill might actually come to be.
You're going to have 5 or 6 ideas. You're going to have taxes, you're going to have immigration, you're going to have deregulation, a bunch of stuff. And then you're going to sort of throw them together and say, okay, if we add one more thing, do we gain net votes or do we lose net votes? And they're going to keep adding and subtracting different big pieces of the puzzle until they figure out a way to get a majority plus one in the Senate, in the House.
So, Mr. Chairman, you're spinning a lot of plates right now. Reportedly, Mick Mulvaney helped to brief GOP House members last week. You may have been in the room. What gets left on the cutting room floor here when you're talking about everything from taxes on overtime to taxes on tips? We've got to manage SALT. And as Mick Mulvaney just said, a lot of things that aren't even part of the tax conversation.
The one big, beautiful bill will have border policy, energy policy, spending cuts, and also tax policy. Those are the 4 main areas that will be in the one big bill that passes out of the House. When you look at the tax provisions, of course, there's a lot of different priorities for people who care about SALT, people who care about various credits, and that just requires every single member to give a little. That's what we're going to have to do in the House of Representatives. We have the smallest majority in the history of America when Elise Stefanik's confirmed as a UN ambassador. And I would just point out that we'll only have one successful bill. We'll only have one. Because if you just look at history, the last time that 2 budget resolutions were ever signed into law in the same year was 1986. And if we think we can defy odds with a much smaller majority, and those 2 reconciliation bills were bipartisan, I got some oceanfront property in Missouri to sell you.
Well, sir, I do wonder about the president's role in this. Obviously, there was a lengthy meeting at the White House regarding his priorities. And to get back to Joe's question about what could get left on the cutting room floor here, is there anything the president has explicitly asked for, be it a lower corporate tax rate or private equity tax breaks, that you do not think is likely to end up in the ultimate package?
You know, we're just going to have to thread the needle. I don't want to exclude or add anything right now because I don't know the budget reconciliation instructions that they're going to give the Ways and Means Committee. Once I get those instructions, I think it'll be a whole lot easier to figure out where the dominoes fall.
Do you need Democrats to pass whatever final product you create?
If we do it by reconciliation, it will have to be passed with just strictly Republican votes. Democrats won't vote for a partisan reconciliation bill. I do believe, though, after the votes are on the board...
What if wildfire relief is in there?
Yeah, wildfire relief won't be in the reconciliation bill because that's discretionary spending, and it can't be within it. But I feel like that you'll still see some Democrats that will vote for the final package, but they won't be the votes that brings us to 218.
Mr. Chairman, as we have this conversation with you this evening, we're awaiting just moments from now an expected executive order signing by the president in the Oval Office, which could have something to do with the implementation of 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. But obviously, we've had a lot of back and forth on tariffs, threatened and pulled back. Are expected revenues from levies factoring at all into the calculations for this reconciliation bill?
It can't be considered within the official calculations of the rules of reconciliation, but when you care about the fiscal health of the nation as a whole, you have to look at the possible influx of future revenues that could come from the president's trade proposals. And across the board, 10% tariff, which the president did campaign on, an across-the-board tariff, that can bring in trillions of dollars. So those are things that you have to look at that can affect the fiscal health of the nation as a whole. But in the rules of reconciliation, CBO and joint tax will not allow those to be scored appropriately.
Well, how about just within your own committee, though, Mr. Chairman? It's really important what you're talking about right now. Will you wait to actually have a sense, as we're waiting to hear from President Trump today? He's going to be speaking in the Oval Office a short time from now about these tariffs. Will you wait to hear what the composite impact is of Donald Trump's tariff policy before you can put the final touches on taxes to know if there's in fact balance there?
Not at all. We don't need to do that. The policies within Donald Trump's tariff priorities is not going to indicate whether we pass a reconciliation bill or not. It's just an added incentive to the economy.
Sir, one more question for you. We heard the president yesterday casting some doubt on irregularities in Treasury payments. Kevin Hassett of the National Economic Council has said that was on the payments, not anything related to the debt. But being in your position on the Ways and Means Committee, deciding taxes and ultimately how the Treasury Department is spending what's in the coffers of the United States, have you been read into these irregularities at all?
You know, we're actually having a subcommittee hearing this week, and we're going to be discussing some of those irregularities and how common are they? What is in fact happening? It's important that we have transparency in all aspects of government, and if there's problems, we need to make sure that they're fixed. If there's irregularities, we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
All right, Republican Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, joining us live from Capitol Hill. Thank you for your time. And still ahead, a judge says the Trump administration must unfreeze federal funds, including the NIH. We'll take a look at the implications for medical and scientific research next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Top research universities are warning about the potential impact on medical care and scientific innovation due to the Trump administration's cut to federal funding from the NIH. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Janet Lorin, who has been following this story and is here with us on Balance of Power. So, Janet, obviously we have seen action in the courts related to this funding freeze. A judge today reinforcing that it needs to be unfrozen, this money that Essentially, the judge was criticizing the Trump administration's efforts for ignoring initial orders. The administration has now appealed. Where does this leave these research institutions and universities who are wondering what funding is ultimately going to come through?
Well, if you're a researcher and you've received a stop work order, you're not going to be doing any work. Research has been disrupted. Then there was news Friday evening about the reimbursement costs, and that had been lowered to a cap of 15%. What does that mean? That means money that, in addition to the actual money for research, you need to pay for lab space, you need to pay for materials, you need to pay for Bunsen burners and things like that, buildings, and also staff. There's also concern about what happens to the people who are helping administrate the grants and jobs. We heard from Susan Collins today, who was questioning what happens to the medical centers in Maine that have been reaching out to her. And she said she had reached out to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. To find out what's happening.
So it sounds to me then, Janet, this is more about just the freezing or unfreezing of money. It's the people or parties that are falling through the cracks when these rulings are made, and it could be weeks or months before funding is restored. Are jobs lost in the process?
Well, I think there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. You know, keep in mind, it's not just Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. It's public research universities like Ohio State, the University of Maine, the Maine Medical Center. Billions of dollars of grants come in from NIH and from other agencies, and people are just not really sure where this is going. You know, you think about where universities fall in the world of federal funding. Harvard, for example, received $700 million last year in federal funding. So it's quite a lot to take in for universities who traditionally have been immune to things like this. When the endowment tax was passed in 2017, nobody could have imagined that college endowments would be taxed.
And Janet, just when we consider the universities themselves and the people employed by them, how big could these ripple effects be beyond the implications for scientific development, but actually economic, if you will?
Good question. Well, Stanford said in a release over the weekend that it could have an impact of about $160 million on their budget. You know, keep in mind these schools have tremendous endowments. Harvard's at $53 billion, Yale is at $41 billion, Stanford is about $36 billion. Well, why can't they use that money to pay for things? The money is somewhat restricted. If you've given a donation to Yale for the crew team, you can't suddenly shift that to pay for scientific research. They're not bank accounts, and they're invested in things like private equity and hedge funds, and they're tied up, and you can't just liquidate them to pay for things.
Got less than a minute here. Janet, you mentioned RFK Jr. He could see a floor vote as soon as this week. Do we have any sense of what he thinks about these monies specific to NIH?
He will, look into it, but it's just not clear where things stand, and I think people are confused, and there's a lot of scurrying in universities trying to figure out what the next steps are. If you've been doing research and you have, for example, stem cells that you've been working on for years and years and years, you don't want to have any issues with those by not working.
Well, we have a lot of questions yet to be answered. Clearly, Janet Lorin, thank you so much for helping us today on Bloomberg. Coming up, President Trump planning to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum. More next on Bloomberg.
We're not that rich right now. We owe $36 trillion. That's because we let all these nations take advantage of us. Same thing, like $200 billion with Canada. We owe $300. We have a deficit with Mexico of $350 billion. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to let that happen.
President Trump making the case for additional tariffs in a Fox News interview yesterday. The president later told reporters that he's planning to impose a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports. The none have been formally announced yet. He has just entered the Oval Office to sign executive orders, though, so we may be getting details any moment now. And as we await them, joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Erica York, Vice President of Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation. Erica, welcome back. Obviously, the president views tariffs in a few ways, one being to make trade more equal in his eyes, the other being as a way to raise revenue to fill the Treasury's coffers as he looks to cut taxes. When we consider these tariffs specifically, 25% on steel and aluminum, what would the ultimate impact be?
It's not clear yet because it depends on how exactly the president decides to structure them. If we look back at the 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs, for instance, based on the trade values then and the rates implied then, Tax Foundation initially estimated those would raise tariffs somewhere around $10 billion, but then we granted exemptions to Canada, to Mexico, to various other trade partners. And ultimately, those didn't end up being a huge revenue raiser because of the exemptions granted. And it's not clear this time around whether ultimately exemptions would be granted again, whether these are entirely new tariffs that apply on top of the remaining steel and aluminum tariffs, whether these are kind of revisions to the old. So it's hard to quantify it yet. It would not be a significant source of revenue to offset the cost of, say, tax cuts, but it would be a significant increase in the cost of production for manufacturing firms in the U.S. that rely on steel and aluminum.
Well, you wonder if going big is the idea here, what the result might be. We talked this morning on Bloomberg with Isaac Boltanski, the Director of Policy Research at BTIG, and had this to say about the differences in Donald Trump's tariff proposal and what he might actually be aiming for here. Listen.
He thinks that there is a structural imbalance that needs to be addressed. And so whether it's the steel and aluminum tariffs or it's these targeted reciprocal tariffs, I think that those are areas where we should expect meaningful, sustained action because the president thinks there's an imbalance that needs to be addressed. Whereas on Canada and Mexico with those 25% tariffs, I think those skewed much more so towards the escalate to de-escalate. What can I get right now?
So if the idea is to correct structural imbalance, you're going to need to go further than, say, 25% tariffs on these particular materials, right? What about products downstream? What about reciprocal tariffs the president has also described?
If the goal is to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, then we're having the wrong conversation by talking about tariffs. The trade deficit reflects an imbalance between saving and investment, and the policy lever that the government has in control of saving is to reduce the federal budget deficit. That can be done through a combination of tax increases or spending decreases, but we're not really talking about an issue of trade policy when we talk about why the U.S. runs a trade deficit. Even though that's intuitively appealing and it sounds like the two would go together, they're not. They're disconnected. The reason that we run persistent trade deficits is because we have a persistent gap between how much we save and how much we invest, and that's met with a capital inflow. We really don't want to be doing anything to discourage investment, so the real policy lever is what can you do to encourage saving. So the conversation about tariffs is misplaced.
Well, but it's a conversation the president does seem very eager to have, and he suggested we'll have more conversations about this throughout the week. As Tuesday or Wednesday, he says he could announce reciprocal tariffs. Erica, presumably that could apply to literally everyone that imposes levies on goods coming from the U.S. Where is that impact most likely to be drastically felt?
If you look at the countries that charge the highest tariffs, they tend to be smaller, developing countries that don't have like large tax administrators to administer an income tax. Overall, though, the U.S. doesn't charge, significantly lower tariffs when we're looking at the overall weighted average compared to our major trading partners. You can find line items where we would charge higher tariffs. But you could also find line items where reciprocity would mean the U.S. actually needs to lower its trade barriers. And if we expand the scope to non-tariff barriers, the U.S. is a big offender when it comes to like anti-dumping and countervailing duties and other forms of non-tariff barriers, whether it's Buy America requirements or subsidies. So reciprocity is also a lot more complicated. And really, I think the upshot of all of these various justifications that we're seeing from the Trump administration is really just that Trump likes tariffs and wants higher tariffs. And whether he uses an argument about reciprocity or about balancing trade or about raising revenue, the ultimate goal is that he wants to impose more tariffs.
Is there an answer to these, like we saw come from Canada, like we saw come from Mexico or even Colombia? These are across-the-board tariffs, but we're talking about Brazil, Mexico, Canada, South Korea, Vietnam. These are friends when it comes to trade partners. Is there anything he's looking to exact from these partners that would create the exemptions we're hearing don't exist?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. I don't think we've seen a clear, outline or ask from the Trump administration as of yet for why they're imposing these tariffs, what they want to see happen. We even saw one of Trump's advisors over the weekend mention that he has problems with value-added taxes in Europe, and he misunderstands how value-added taxes function and is using those as an excuse for tariffs. So again, at the end of the day, really seems like the goal here is that Trump wants to rely more on tariffs than he does other types of taxes. And he's raising lots of different justifications, many of them economically incorrect, for why he wants to raise tariffs. And really, this is kind of a repeat of what we saw in 2018 and 2019. We put steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a time under national security arguments, which again is disconnected and doesn't make sense. And the goal really was to impose more tariffs.
Well, Erica, on the way in which this fits into tax policy, this is something we spoke about just moments ago here on Balance of Power with the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith. And this is what he said the tariff impact could be on the pending budget reconciliation bill.
When you care about the fiscal health of the nation as a whole, you have to look at the possible influx of future revenues that could come from the president's trade proposals. And across the board, 10% tariff, which the president did campaign on, an across-the-board tariff, that can bring in trillions of dollars. So those are things that you have to look at that can affect the fiscal health of the nation as a whole. But in the rules of reconciliation, CBO and joint tax will not allow those to be scored appropriately.
Throwing $1 trillion handle around here, Erica, is this the solution to making sure tax cuts don't add to the deficit, or does the math not work like that?
Tariffs would be one of the worst ways to try to offset the cost of tax cuts. An across-the-board tariff of 10% could raise roughly $2 trillion over the budget window, but it would raise that in a really economically harmful way. And it would invite foreign countries to retaliate against the U.S. And when you count the economic harms from tariffs plus retaliation, it could very well offset any economic benefits from tax cuts. It could also redistribute the burden of the tax system onto lower and middle income households. If the tax cuts you're providing are disproportionately tilted to upper income households, and the offset that you're using, namely tariffs, falls disproportionately on lower income households, we could be in a world where the ultimate effect of the tax package is to raise taxes on lower and middle income households. So tariffs should not be part of the conversation for revenue. The administration should really avoid doing that, and lawmakers should try to push back against that because it cuts against, the goal of providing tax relief to Americans, and it cuts against the goal of trying to craft a tax reform package that will grow the U.S. economy.
And just like that, President Trump just about now to sign the executive order in the Oval Office. He just signed it. 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. We'll have much more on this as we learn more from our reporters in the room. Erica, great to have you back. Erica York is Vice President of Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation. Coming up, we'll look at the political implications here of what just happened in the Oval Office. 25% tariffs. Our political panel's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Breaking news on Bloomberg TV and radio. President Trump has just signed an executive action we've been telling you about, putting 25% tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. No exemptions or exceptions. Bloomberg now also reporting the tariffs target finished products as well. This is happening as we speak in the Oval Office. We'll be seeing and hearing from the president in a short time. Joining us now, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic strategist Jeannie Shanzano, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside Maura Gillespie, Republican strategist, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies. They join myself and Kaylee Lines in Washington right now. Jeannie, your first reaction. We had a long wind-up to this, and we've seen on-again, off-again conversations about tariffs against Canada and Mexico, for instance. This is being written as we speak. The president just signed it with the Sharpie. Big questions about the economic impact. What will be the political one?
Yeah, I mean, I think none of us can be surprised. Going back to the 1980s, to me, this is one thing that Donald Trump has consistently talked about. He fashions himself, William McKinley incarnate. I mean, he loves William McKinley. He talks about the fact that he's the tariff man. McKinley described himself as a tariff man on a tariff platform. He loved reciprocity as a means of tariff, and that's what we're seeing with Donald Trump. I think he views this as a critical negotiation tool, amongst other things, and an issue of fairness. For Donald Trump, there are winners and losers. And when you have an imbalance like he sees when he looks at these numbers, he says we're losing. He's long said that. And to win, he is going to use tariffs. So he sees this very much as a celebratory moment, unlike most economists who look at it as a very different type of approach. But I don't think we can be surprised.
Well, the president is speaking to reporters in the Oval Office right now, suggesting that the tariffs on metals could go higher, potentially could exceed even 25%. He also says that the administration will be looking at tariffs on chips and cars. To Jeannie's point, though, more about whether or not we should be surprised by this, the president made no secret of his feelings on tariffs on the campaign trail. And by and large, it seemed that actually with the American electorate, this idea is popular.
And I think you're going to see a lot of his supporters and those who voted for him give him a bit of grace here and to see how it shakes out, because you're right, they did vote for him. And with that tough talk on saying how he was going to put tariffs to lower costs for Americans. But as economists have pointed out, the immediate impact is going to be higher costs on Americans. And so I think that's an important thing for us to watch as voters see how long they can endure before they feel the relief that President Trump has promised them. It'll be interesting to see how long they hold on in support of his plan, because he did, talk a big game about lowering costs for Americans when it comes to groceries, housing, and things like that. And this tariff announcement, and with our already, bit of frayed relationships now with Canada and Mexico, especially now with this, Canada's relationship will be a little more frayed on top of the end of the tariff delay that we have until March 1st.
He's talking about reciprocal tariffs as well here, Jeannie. It's time to be reciprocal, is the quote, as he tries to zero out essentially trade relations with many of our partners. Will we end up losing some of our partners through this?
I think that is absolutely a possibility, and that is one of the many things that people are very concerned about. If you are another country looking at what is going on in the United States, the threats, the way that he has fulfilled these threats, and just the uncertainty overall, you may feel that it is time to turn elsewhere. It is time to look for alliances elsewhere. And I think, what's so disturbing for so many people is this includes many of our allies. It's not lost on any of us that the tariffs a week or two ago, lost in time, were 25% on our closest allies in Mexico and Canada, and just 10% on China. And so I do think that is a big threat. And people look at these kinds of actions and they are going to be judging him based on the economic impact. And I think that's where the markets are critically important. Donald Trump historically listens to the markets. If there is pushback on this, he will likely listen to that, and he may be willing to negotiate some of this down.
Well, and there's a question about negotiating with Australia specifically. We know he spoke with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, earlier today, and Trump just said in the Oval Office he will give consideration to an exemption of these tariffs on Australia specifically. When we consider, though, the wider context with which this is happening, Maura, he obviously using executive authority here through Section 232 to enact these tariffs, things he can do via the office of the president, whereas he's running into legal challenges in many instances in the last few days, with judges blocking his attempts to rein in government, saying he's exceeding executive authority.
Yeah, you're going to see these issues come up time and time again where Trump is full steam ahead and is throwing a lot of things at the wall, seeing what will stick. But again, I think that his supporters and many on the Republican side, while I'm sure some in Congress are wishing that they were more part of the conversation, I think that by and large, Trump supporters are happy to see him taking action. For a lot of those voters, they watched as Joe Biden sat by in their view, right? They didn't feel like much was being done, and they felt the quality of their lives were in decline. And so they're looking for change, and that's what they voted for. And Donald Trump is certainly not keeping things stagnant and certainly not at a status quo. Whether that's a great thing or not, proves to be seen. But for his voters, they are certainly on board with changing things and shaking things up in a way that may benefit their bottom dollar.
Headlines crossing the terminal. Trump tariffs on metals could go higher. As Kayleigh mentioned, we'll be looking at chips in cars with the idea of reciprocal tariffs. Jeannie, what's a Democrat to say this evening, knowing that this is playing well politically, domestically?
Yeah, it's playing well so far. I mean, we look at the CBS poll out this week, and CBS and New York Times had him above water at 53, historically low, but higher than Donald Trump was in his first term. But let's not forget, this time for Joe Biden, he was over 60%. And boy, did that fall quickly after the Afghanistan withdrawal. So events like these are the very things that trigger a president to lose support. And that support will most likely be lost when all of these actions catch up to the president and people start to feel the effect. And so Maura mentioned earlier, the costs at the grocery store, the costs in people's lives, the minute they start to feel those, you can bet that his support will drop. So that's what Donald Trump is going to have to pay particular attention to. And for Democrats, there's not a lot they can do at this point because they don't have the power. They can stand up and they can warn, but there's not a lot they can do. It is up to Republicans in the Congress, in the courts, and elsewhere to stand up and try to be a wall, just try to be sort of a bulwark against Donald Trump if there's anything illegal or unconstitutional. But politically, it's going to be when people start to feel things that his numbers could drop. But so far, he's in pretty good position, and he knows that.
Well, and Maura, do you see any sign of that Republican congressional check taking shape?
Congress is interesting in that they like to have their separation of powers, their checks and balances. But with the House, I'd say that they are really, step in line behind President Trump and trying not to step out of line in a lot of ways. So they're not going to be that bulwark or be that wall, as Jeannie mentioned, because they support the president and they support the fact that their constituents voted for him as well and want to at least see it through. And we will, again, we'll see how it pans out if it really does lower costs for the American people. But it's a bit too soon to tell. And I think just his brash nature of things tends to catch people off guard and cause us to have concerns that are valid. But it's too soon for Republicans to, I think, at this point, speak up and say this is the wrong choice. They're not going to do that.
All right, Maura Gillespie and Jeannie Shanzano are staying with us for final thoughts up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A key procedural vote happening in the United States Senate right now to advance the confirmation of Tulsi Gabbard to be the next director of national intelligence. And back with us for final thoughts is this evening's political panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Maura Gillespie. Jeannie, we just have about 2 minutes left here, so if we could quickly get answers from each of you. Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., for that matter, look likely to be confirmed this week. Should any of us be surprised?
No, I don't think. Once they got through committee, it is almost unthinkable that they wouldn't get confirmed. So not surprised, but it is very telling about where the Senate on the Republican side is at this point. It is truly Donald Trump's party, and that's being reflected in pushing through these two very controversial nominees.
Case in point, Punchbowl says Mitch McConnell voted in favor of Tulsi Gabbard. Maura, is the transformation complete?
I'd say yes. I think that the biggest tell for me was those conversations that senators who had been on the fence and who had been very concerned, and rightfully so, that Tulsi Gabbard refused to call Edward Snowden a traitor or Bashar al-Assad a war criminal. But they were reporting, it was reported that they had said that their conversations with J.D. Vance and others in the Trump world and Trump leadership is what swayed their opinion, not Tulsi Gabbard herself or anything that she had said or encouraged them. So their confidence was in the Trump team, not necessarily in their trust in Tulsi Gabbard.
Interesting. Jeannie Shanzano, Maura Gillespie, thank you both for a great panel, a great conversation against the backdrop of breaking news, as we just heard and brought to you live here on Balance of Power. Donald Trump taking Sharpie to paper here and putting into effect 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. It appears they will kick in the 4th of March, Kaylee, but it's not just the raw products themselves.
No, it's finished products as well. This is further down the chain, if you will, which potentially could widen the impact. The president also telling reporters in the Oval Office that it's possible the rate of the tariff goes even higher.
That's
and in
right.
the coming days, we could expect reciprocal tariffs to be announced by the president. He says they'll be looking at chips and cars as well.
We haven't heard the end of this. We should also mention a full and unconditional pardon for the former Illinois governor, Rod Blagojevich, who served time for trying to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat. In honor to do it, he says, I've watched him. He was set up by a lot of bad people. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. We've got a lot to catch up on. Find it on the terminal and online.
Never a shortage of news, and we'll be back with more news tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.